Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of Austica's Research Festival. We've got Daniel Poole and Felicity Sedgewick talking about open research this morning with the Symposium. So open research is the practice of making research more transparent and easier to access. It can be important as it enables people to understand how research was conducted and how findings have been reached. Open research practices are not, however, common practice in autism research, but should they be, and how important are they? So, as I said, Dan and Felicity are going to discuss this morning. And Dan's just going to talk you through the symposium quickly and talk about some of the ways that you can engage throughout.
Thanks, Ned. And huge thanks to Autistica for inviting us to present today. So in this symposium, we're going to be zooming in on one aspect of open research practices, which is pre-registration in autism research. So in the first part, I'm going to be explaining what that term is and talking a little bit about pre-registration in autism research. And then in the second part, Felicity will be presenting about qualitative pre-registration. So throughout, we're really keen to hear from you, your comments and feedback. And if you can put any comments and questions in the Slido that we'll be able to address during the Q&A for about 10 minutes at the end. But we'd also really like to hear your views offline as well. So there's going to be a Padlet that we put into the chat. And if just over time, just any questions, comments, feedback, what you think about all this, we'd really welcome it. I should note that I do say at the beginning of the presentation about the Padlet being dropped in the chat, just to keep things a bit easier. That's actually going to happen at the end of the presentation rather than at the point I mention it. But thanks very much, and I look forward to interacting with you in the chat at the Q&A at the end.
Hi. So our presentation today is going to be on how we bring pre-registration to autism research. This presentation is divided into two parts. So in the first part, it's going to be me talking, and I'm going to be providing an introduction to the concept of pre-registration within the context of autism research. Then in part two, hopefully you'll be at this point familiar with the concept, and Felicity is going to be talking about moving things forward, developing some ideas for a toolkit for qualitative pre-registration that can be used for autism research. There's a Padlet where you can comment your thoughts and some ideas around this that someone will be dropping into the chat for us now. Just want to say that this presentation emerged from Felicity and myself, both participating in a fantastic workshop that was organised in January by the Open Autism Research Group. This is led by Dr. Hannah Hobson, and many of the ideas we're presenting today came out of that meeting. There's a website. You can check that out, and it has more information and resources around this topic. So my part one, is going to be further divided into three different parts. Firstly, I'm going to be describing a problem that pre-registration can address. This is questionable research practices. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how pre-registration can address these issues. And then finally, having a look at how common pre-registration currently is in autism research. So what's the problem? The problem is what are called questionable research practices. I've mentioned this word, this phrase so far. And in a nutshell, this describes a continuum of different behaviors which undermine the integrity and reliability of research. I'm going to try and illustrate a bit about what this means via an example from a imaginary, unscrupulous researcher who's called Professor P. Hacking. Professor Hacking is interested in emotion recognition. He designs a study where he shows a group of autistic people and a group of non-autistic people a set of different emoticons. These are the ones in the middle of the screen here, and asks them to identify which emotion each one of them shows: happy, neutral, sad. Professor Hacking theorizes that autistic people have some difficulty with identifying emotions, and this leads him to predict that the accuracy of the autistic group will be lower than the non-autistics. That is, they'll make more mistakes when they're trying to identify these emoticons. He runs a study, and this is the data. We have accuracy here on the y-axis with the autistic group in yellow and the non-autistic group in orange. As you can hopefully see, both groups are very accurate overall. They're close to 100% performance on this made-up task. And the thing that Professor Hacking is interested in is how the groups compare. He runs the stats comparing the groups, and none of the comparisons are statistically significant. That is, the p-values are all above the 0.05 threshold. So really, this is where Professor Hacking might have stopped. He might have written up this null finding as it is, in a potentially informative piece of work. Instead, he thinks to himself, I was interested in accuracy, but the software I used to run the study does automatically collect response times. What if I have a look at these instead? So this figure shows the response time data that he'd inadvertently collected. So it's in milliseconds. So lower response speeds means that you're faster. And here we can see that overall, the autistic group had slightly quicker response speeds. They were a bit faster when they were responding on this task. But the professor does the analysis, compares the groups, and is delighted because his eyes are drawn to this p-value that's below 0.05, and he's thinking, oh, great, I've done some really good research here. But this is where our first questionable research practice warning alarm goes off. This is for p-hacking. Essentially, p-hacking is selectively analyzing the data, fishing around, reanalyzing, looking at different measures, trying to find a result that works, with work in this context, meaning typically having a p-value below 0.05. So he's happy now, but he's looking at his data and thinking, yeah, so I've got this one p-value below 0.05, but the others aren't like that. It's not nice and neat, and I want a nice, neat story to get published in a fancy journal. What if I leave out the other conditions and the accuracy data, just so it all ties together a bit nicer? And so this data instead looks like this. But this is where our second questionable research practices alarm goes off. This is for selective reporting, selectively omitting details of the study in order to tell a clearer, neater story. So Professor Hacking now, instead of showing all the data points like on the previous figures, he decides instead to calculate his error bars and make this difference look a bit more impressive. And this is what he's got. And now he's just looking at his data and he's thinking, oh, well, my original hypothesis was that autistics would be less accurate on this task compared with non-autistics. I didn't support this hypothesis. Autistic people had similar accuracy, but were a bit faster. Professor Hacking mistakenly thinks that being a good researcher is being able to find evidence in support of your hypothesis. And probably even more importantly, the results he's planning to present, response times don't make sense in the context of the original hypothesis, accuracy, which is about accuracy. So he decides to pretend instead that he had a different hypothesis all along, that autistic people would be faster on this task. But he has to come up with some rationale for that hypothesis. His original theory was that autistic people have problems identifying emotions. His new hypothesis doesn't really coherently emerge from that theory. So he devises some spurious alternative theory that autistic people have an abnormally fast neutral face, a neutrality identifying system. This is where our third questionable research practice is warning alarm sounds. This is for what's called harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. This is where a hypothesis is based on the results of the study, but is presented as if it had been decided on in advance. So research should be attempting to get us closer to the truth. When doing confirmatory research, we make predictions, and if those predictions repeatedly withstand stringent tests, then we start to believe that they're more likely to be true. Questionable research practices, like the ones I've just described, these increase what are called false positives. So apparently positive findings, which are unlikely to be true. So it's a bit like the cowboy shown here in this picture. If the cowboy fires wildly and then draws targets around the bullet holes, we shouldn't be impressed that he's a really accurate marksman. These kinds of false positives are damaging in numbers of ways. So researchers can end up spending time and resources trying to develop on questionable research. What's more, the general public can end up with false impressions about autism based on this kind of research. And most importantly, I think that the research and anything which is really built upon it will be very unlikely to benefit autistic people's lives. So we don't want to be like Professor Hacking. But I want to make totally clear, this is a really extreme example. This person is actually fraudulent, and very few probably know autism researchers behave quite in this kind of way. But they are referred to as questionable research practices rather than fraudulent research practices. These kind of questionable research practices exist on a continuum. Research studies are often really complex, and there are many, many different decisions we have to make in the whole research process. Flexibility in each small decision can increase the potential of erasing that false positive rate. This leads me on to part 2. What can we do about this? How do we avoid getting into this situation? And researchers can use pre-registration to be transparent about our decision-making and try to reduce questionable research practices. So what is pre-registration? I've been saying this word throughout since the beginning of this presentation. And in a sense, it's incredibly simple. And it may surprise some people here that this isn't already what's the standard, what's the norm. Simply put, pre-registration is where a researcher says what they're going to do in advance of running a study. And there are 2 flavors of this. There are registered reports, which is where this pre-registration is peer-reviewed, and what I'm just going to refer to as pre-registration for the rest of this presentation, which is not peer-reviewed. Registered reports are the gold standard. There are 2 stages. So before any data is collected, the researcher will submit the introduction, methods, and analysis to a journal. It'll be assessed by reviewers. The study can then be accepted in principle. This is a commitment that as long as the study runs as planned, the journal will publish the paper, whatever the findings are. Then at stage 2, which is after the data is collected and analysed, the researcher just finishes the rest of the paper off and it's published. On the other hand, the sort of standard version of pre-registration, distinct from a registered report, this is just even simpler still. This is a document just describing what a study will do. It's better if this is time-stamped, so we can have a bit more trust that it was definitely prepared in advance, and even better still if it's publicly available before the study has been run, so other researchers can find it. What does this look like? Rather than just give a sort of generic example, I'm going to try and illustrate what is involved with an example from my own research. So I'm going to describe the pre-registration of a paper that was published earlier this year in Journal of Experimental Psychology General. This was part of my last postdoc, which was called the Autism Timing Study. In this study, we were testing the previous suggestion that autistic people have some problem with timing. The major question we had was that from wider experimental work, we know there are many, many different types of timing, but what it was that previous researchers were describing as issues with timing in autism was a bit underspecified. And so we wanted to try and get to the bottom of this by using a big battery of different timing tasks, cognitive tests and questionnaires to try and see if there were meaningful differences. I'm not going to actually talk about the findings of this study. I did present it last year at this conference, and I think you can find the video on YouTube still if you're interested, or email me. So the study's just come out, but the starting point was way, way back in 2017, 2018. I'd been learning at this point about open research, including pre-registration, but at that point I hadn't actually done it before. So when you're planning a study like this, you start out thinking about what the different things, like what the predictions are, what the methods will be suitable to test these predictions, and then what kind of analysis will be able to provide evidence for or against those predictions. And I talked earlier about the flexibility. So when you think of those elements, predictions, method, analysis, there are many, many different sub-decisions which can shape those decisions. So it's not important the detail on this map, but I've just drawn a little map here with just a few examples that came to mind to me. Each of these white lines that's emerging from predictions, method, and analysis have many possible decisions that can be made. There's a great deal of possible flexibility. Just to pluck one example, I might think with the method, and I'm trying to devise the measures. I might ask myself, what are the key measures that are going to be derived from this experiment? What conditions have I calculated that from? How exactly am I going to calculate it? If we're working in psychology, as I do, we are measuring something really complex, a human being. So there are an enormous amount of possibilities just thinking about how you measure performance and behavior. So essentially in the experiment I'm talking about in this timing study, I had 13 different studies. So now when you think of it this way, you can barely even see the white lines anymore. And this just really illustrates the amount of possible flexibility that was presented to me. So I thought in this context, it's really particularly important that we pre-registered as many of these decisions as was possible. So how did I do it? I used a template. This was specifically designed for psychology research. So it had prompts about the kinds of information that I should be thinking about including. If you go to the Open Science Framework, which is one place where you might pre-register a study, there are many different templates available, or you can opt to follow no template at all, just write whatever you want. So preparing the pre-registration from the template took quite a lot of time to try and flesh out all the details and anticipate all the possible decisions we might have needed to make and what we would be asked about when the paper was being reviewed. I'm not going to go through everything now, it'll get a bit boring, but just to give you a flavour thought about who was going to take part in my study. It was involved thinking about what our target sample size, but also what our inclusion criteria were. So, for instance, in this study, we didn't exclude participants who had other forms of neurodivergence or any mental health conditions from the study, and so I pre-registered this in advance. This decision was locked in. I went through each task in turn and tried to explain as best as possible what they were supposed to be measuring and what we predicted. I also described what the participant was going to be asked to do on that task, so I couldn't selectively report anything. That was all described in full. I was going to identify when it was that someone might not have been able to do the task. For instance, if they, ways of telling from the data that perhaps they didn't understand the instruction, so they were too tired or they were responding randomly. So I had a sort of strict criteria of how I identified that. So again, I can't just selectively report what I want. I also pre-registered how the data would be prepared. So that is how the dependent variables would be calculated and what we would do about things like missing data, which commonly arise in larger studies. And then finally, what statistical tests I was going to use and how these mapped onto those original predictions. All this information went into a document that was then uploaded to the Open Science Framework. And this is a screenshot from the page, and you can see there's a little timestamp there next to the document that says pre-reg, investigating timing in autism. In the spirit of transparency, I want to tell you about aspects of the published manuscript which weren't included in that pre-registration. We found that one of the criteria we used for identifying participants who couldn't do one of the tasks was too conservative, and this meant too many participants would have been removed where their data actually looked fine when I looked at it after having run the study. So we slightly tweaked what that criteria was. Second, we had some spatial constraints in the final manuscript, word limits and so on. So we swapped around a measure that went in the manuscript, and this instead went into the supplementary materials and used a different measure in the paper. It didn't change anything, but it just kept the length of the write-up down so we could fit into the word limits. And there was also some exploratory analysis, some of which we had wanted to do ourselves and had sort of thought about beforehand, and some of which a reviewer asked us to include during the peer review process. I want to point this out as sometimes an objection to pre-registration is that it's too restrictive. This isn't the case. If you deviate from what you planned, you just make this clear in the final work, and the reviewer and other people who are reading your work are in a position to be able to evaluate whether these decisions were justified or not. So I'm on a learning journey with all of this, and there are plenty of things I would have done differently. So firstly, simulating data would really have helped me. What I was trying to do was just sit down and think about every possible decision, every area of analytic flexibility. And it would have been much more straightforward to just generate fake data for each task, work through a dummy analysis, and then use this to identify the decisions we might have made. Secondly, I was reluctant to make the pre-registration publicly available. Honestly, I found the idea of it being scrutinized before it had gone through that buffer of the peer review process a bit scary. I now see that was totally silly. Only someone super keen would have read the pre-registration, and anyone that keen, it would probably only been a great benefit to. They might have been planning something similar, and they could have seen what I was doing in advance, not having to wait all those years until the study, the paper was actually published. I now just want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities arising from pre-registration in autism research. So firstly, a pre-registration is not a panacea. It's not a pre-registered study is not automatically better than a non-pre-registered study. You can have a vague pre-registration, and you shouldn't be lulled into seeing it as an automatic mark of quality. Second, accurately predetermining sample sizes can be a bit more challenging for autism researchers than those doing research with non-autistic people. Autism researchers are drawing on a smaller population, and also because the contribution of autistic people can sometimes come at a greater cost in terms of the disruption caused by traveling to labs and really just taking part in research. So understandably, autistic people's interest in taking part in research can sometimes wax and wane. Third is around thinking about which the smallest effects are that are meaningful to us. This is a really important detail that we should ideally be including in our pre-registration documents, because it provides us with a boundary which can help indicate when we can reject our predictions or when we accept them but say that the effect is very small. This can be quite challenging to determine. So when we think of things, measures we might use in cognitive sciences, like response times and brain activity, these measures can sometimes reflect very small differences between autistic and non-autistic people. Some of these really small differences may have a really big downstream effect on cognition and on behavior. Other really small differences may have no meaningful effect, and they may not be meaningful. There are also opportunities. So hopefully, most obviously, the increased transparency of pre-registration. It should help demystify the research process and how researchers have arrived at their predictions and how they design their studies to test those predictions. There's also an opportunity for improving the pathway to participatory research, developing pre-registrations in collaboration with autistic people to ensure that the autistic voice is embedded from the beginning of the study. Takes me on to the third part of the presentation, which is how common is pre-registration in autism research. Hopefully, I've convinced you that pre-registration is a valuable tool which could potentially improve the transparency and reliability of autism research. You may remember earlier I highlighted that registered reports, the peer-reviewed version of pre-registration, that this is the gold standard. At the time I'm recording this, there are no registered reports which have been published in any of the autism-focused journals. This is shortly due to change as research in autism spectrum disorders has just started to offer this as a publication type, and there's a special issue using registered reports coming out in 2023. Perhaps some of the other journals will start offering registered reports soon. So now we know we're just focusing on standard pre-registration. I'd invite you to think about this just for a second based on what we've talked about so far. So since 2011, this is an era of widening adaptation of open research practices like pre-registration in the wider sciences and wider research culture. What percentage of studies do you think were published in top autism journals that pre-registered their work? From what I've said so far, you're probably likely to assume it's going to be at the lower end, or I wouldn't really be talking about this. So do you think it's more than 20%, 20 to 10%, 10% to 1%, or less than 1%? So I've done a systematic search to try and get a bit of an estimate of this. I want to make clear this is really quite a crude estimate, but it gives a bit of a sense of where we're at. Just to explain what I did, so I used Dimensions, which is a tool for literature searching, which allows you to search for keywords through the entire paper instead of in the title and keywords. The search terms I used were pre-register, spelt a few different ways, open science framework, and as predicted, which are two common places to submit pre-registrations. For the purposes of this, I focused on autism research journals, so where it says limited to. This is a list of journals I searched. These are all autism journals which mainly publish research testing hypotheses, doing this kind of confirmatory research. They also are the journals I read most often, and I think that they are the top selection in terms of impact factor. And like I said before, I constrained the search to since 2011, although I don't expect the final results would change that much if you widen this out, but it just saved me searching for a lot more work. So this search generated 643 titles, which I then hand searched. By this, I mean I searched the document for some key terms to see if I could find any mention of anything that was a pre-registration. I also skimmed through the method and results section as well, just to double check. Of those studies, 129 were pre-registered. The vast majority of these studies were clinical trials or systematic reviews, which really are supposed to pre-register in line with the guidance around these types of articles. A further 18 said that they were pre-registered, but for 13 of these, I couldn't find the pre-registration. For instance, there just wasn't a link or a working link in the paper. I should say 5 of these were in the Dutch trial registry, which I couldn't seem to access when I was doing this search. But if I Googled it, I could see that there was some sort of document. I just couldn't read it. So it's not the author's fault. 3 of the 18 were locked, and but 2 of those I was then given access to later when I requested it. And 2 of those studies were pre-registered, or they had a pre-registration document, but they didn't include the analysis that was in the manuscript. It was part of a wider study. Just to contextualize that, 129 that were pre-registered. Over this time frame, there were 10,562 publications in those journals. So what percentage of studies published in autism research journals were pre-registered? It's less than 1%. So I do want to include some caveats. So firstly, this only includes autism research published in autism research journals. There is a lot of autism research that's published elsewhere, although I think this is the bulk of where autism research studies would have been published. Could be that much more of the work that's being published in other journals is pre-registered. Note that the work that I presented earlier of my own was published in a non-autism focused journal. Second caveat is not all of those 10,562 papers in this time would have been confirmatory studies. There would have been some qualitative studies, some commentaries, some explicitly exploratory studies. Now this distinction between confirmatory and sort of exploratory and qualitative research will be fleshed out a bit more in Felicity's part in part 2 of this presentation. I want to be really clear. Exploratory research is really valuable in many, many, many ways, but it is only useful when the people reading it know that it actually is exploratory. I should note that although there will have been some exploratory work, the vast majority of these papers likely were confirmatory hypothesis testing studies, and hopefully when we're looking at this again in a decade's time, that percentage of pre-registered studies will have increased somewhat. So hopefully I've convinced you pre-registration is a valuable tool which can improve the reliability and transparency of autism research. I think it's particularly important as when autism research is more reliable, it is more likely that it's approaching something which is true, and thus there is a better chance of translation and impact on autistic people's lives. However, at the moment, pre-registration is currently not widely adopted in autism research. Since 2011, less than 1% of publications in autism research journals have been pre-registered.
Hi, I'm here today to think about what pre-registration might look like for qualitative research. We've heard a lot about quant research, and that is normally where pre-registration is used, but we want to think about whether this can work for qualitative studies as well, and particularly in autism work. So in quant work, pre-registration is basically about making things explicit before you do the study or publish the findings. And the same is true for qualitative work, and I'm going to talk through the different aspects of how that might work for qualitative studies. So the first point in quantitative research with a pre-registration is that you have reasoned research questions. And honestly, that should be the case regardless of whether you're doing qual or quant or mixed methods. Regardless of your methods, you should have research questions that have a clear rationale that come clearly from the background literature, from the previous work, and from the theory. Where we start to see major differences is when we look at hypotheses, largely because qualitative work tends not to have them. So you can't test your hypotheses in qualitative studies because actually qualitative work is what's called exploratory or inductive. So rather than having specific hypotheses that we're trying to test, we are looking to explore people's experiences of something or their opinions on something. And the analysis is inductive often, so that means that it is led by the data rather than having, as I say, specific hypotheses that you're going to see what the answer is. Despite that, I would argue that actually those links to theories that are relevant for the research questions are also important for how you approach thinking about your data in general. So as long as you can show that you have a clear link to your theories or link to previous work, then you've justified doing this qualitative study. The validity of measures is also something that's very different in qualitative research. So in quant work, we look at the validity or the reliability statistically of the measures we're using, or kind of the internal coherence of an experiment we're running. That doesn't really work for interview questions or focus group questions. But what you can do is make sure that what you share is really clear and highly detailed. So not just sharing kind of your 8 main questions, but also including your planned prompt questions, or if you end up asking questions that aren't on your interview schedule, recording that change and including that in your kind of write-up later on. You could also do things like include the intro or outro kind of chat that you do, so that somebody else coming in could look at your documentation and give as close to a repeat of your interview as is possible in a semi-structured interview kind of setting. Sample size is also very different in qualitative studies. For quant work and pre-registration, justified sample size usually means doing a power calculation to work out how many people you need to have in order to have kind of statistical outcomes which are reliable, which make sense, and which are trustworthy in effect. In qualitative work, you tend to see people justify their sample size in terms of data saturation, which means we talked to this many people and then we reached data saturation, so nothing new was coming out. I'd argue that that's actually quite hard to define because everybody's got different life experiences. There's always going to be something new in somebody's interview responses, but it's more about are there any new major themes coming from the data, or are you starting to just get confirmation of the things that other people have already said? In a minute, I'm also going to talk about the fact that we should make the rationale for who we talk to really clear, not just the numbers. And I think that's particularly important in autism research. The kind of analysis plans we can do in qualitative pre-registration are also quite different. So again, for quant research, you would normally lay out exactly which statistical analyses you're going to do, in what order, with which subsets of the data or which comparison groups. Qualitative work isn't like that. Again, because it's inductive and led by the data, your analysis is going to look slightly different depending on what people say to you. So that doesn't mean, though, that everything is totally subjective, totally out the window, there's no rules. You still tend to know that you're going to use thematic analysis or content analysis or interpretive phenomenological analysis. And there are steps and kind of protocols for how you do that. So outlining those steps and making it clear what protocols you're going to follow is really important. I think the other thing that's important for pre-registering qualitative studies is being open about who is going to do that analysis. Who is it within the team? What's their positionality? How do they relate to the data? And also what checking there's going to be of the analysis that people do. So are other members of the team going to check it? Or are you going to, for example, go back to your participants and check that they agree with your interpretation of their words, which is something I've done in studies before and which is a really interesting process. So making all of that really clear and laying it out from the start so that everybody knows what the plan is for doing this analysis. The final point is about data storage and data sharing protocols. This is something which you should have regardless of what kind of methods you're doing. It should be a requirement for getting ethical approval that you have clear and ethical data storage and data sharing protocols. But when it comes to qualitative work, I think it's particularly important. You need to be very clear about exactly what will and won't be kept. So, for example, will you keep all of the raw recordings of your interviews and focus groups, or are you actually only going to keep the transcripts and you're going to delete those original recordings? Equally, you then need to think about what will or won't be shared. Will you share the recordings if you keep them? Will you only share the transcripts even if you keep the recordings? Thinking through those things and making them clear so that anybody else reading them can understand exactly what you've done with that data. This is also something which I think is particularly important in autism research, as I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides' time. So, from that very rapid rundown of qualitative pre-registration kind of general principles, what does this look like in autism research? We think that actually pre-registering qualitative research could help provide information and reassurance to the autism community about the study that's being done. And that's really important because there is a history of researchers not being as open as they could be, and then using data in ways that participants weren't expecting. And that's not good. That's not great ethically, and it's certainly not great for the autistic people who gave their time to take part. We'd also argue that actually, if you make your pre-registration really good, you make it clear and accessible and really precise, it effectively becomes the ultimate participant information sheet, because these are all of the things that your participants are likely to want to know. So you've already written them up and you've made it as clear as possible. I think these are some of the reasons why that can work so well. Being really open about the connection between your work and previous work or theories helps people understand why you're asking the questions you are and why it matters. And giving people that information can often help motivate them to want to take part, but also means that they come to the study with an understanding of why you're interested and what it might be that you're interested in from them. I also think being open about your expectations increases the clarity, and that's one of the most valuable things about pre-registration. It stops your participants feeling like they're talking into a black box. So it can feel like sometimes you take part in a study, you talk to the interviewer, you give them all this information about yourself, and then 2 years later you see that they've published a paper which doesn't feel that closely connected to anything you were talking about, and that feels very jarring and kind of not, it feels very strange to see that your words have been used in a way you weren't necessarily expecting. So sharing what's going to happen, who's going to analyze it, what the kind of framing paradigm is, makes that much clearer for people. Also, sharing things like your interview questions early and keeping track of whether they change and why they've changed means that your participants can feel much more prepared. And that's a good thing, because it tends to mean that people are much less anxious. It means that they can think about their answers in advance. It means that they don't feel taken off guard by a question on the day. That's really good for your participant. You know, we want to reduce anxiety if we can. It's also good for researchers though, because if your participants are more comfortable and less anxious, you tend to get better data from them because they're in a space where they're more able to reflect with you, they're able to remember more, they're able to tell you more, and they're able to communicate more clearly. So it's now standard practice for me in my research to share interview questions in advance, and I'd highly recommend it to people because I do think you get much richer data when you do that. I said earlier that I'd come back to the point about who you want to talk to, as well as how many people in your sample. And this is really important because it can be easy for us to, as researchers, have a very clear sense of who we want to talk to and why. that we don't then communicate. And this is something I ran into as part of my PhD a few years ago now. I was doing research on the experiences of autistic girls and young women, and I had some very challenging but really useful conversations with some older autistic women who were saying, well, why aren't you interested in my experiences? And I had a very good kind of rationale for the age range I was looking at. And once I'd explained that, you know, we had a really interesting conversation about it. But making that clear from the outset avoids those feelings of exclusion, which are really important in the autism community, because there are so many aspects of the community that have been ignored, that have been excluded from research. So for people to be able to see that you've thought about this, that you're not just kind of automatically going to the same group you always go to, or the same group that people usually go to, or if you are going to those groups, why that's important for this study, really again increases that transparency between autism researchers and the community, and particularly for autistic autism researchers. It can help explain why, even though they are members of the community, they can't try and speak for everyone, or they can't try and support everyone in every study, which can be really important. So I think one of the big questions left about what does pre-registration of qualitative work look like in autism research is about data sharing. So the concern around data sharing generally for qual and quant is about making sure that your participants are not identifiable. So if another scientist came along, opened up your data set, wanted to do some analysis with it, they couldn't work out who was in your data set. They couldn't go and find me from the interview transcript, for example. And that is harder with qualitative data, because in interviews, in focus groups, in this kind of more open-ended questioning, people tend to tell us a lot more about themselves and about their lives. And we tend to be asking potentially more personalized, kind of individualized questions. So you need to think really carefully about things like how you're going to manage anonymization of transcripts. If I was taking part in a study and I mentioned that I lived in Bristol, would Bristol remain in the transcript, or would it be replaced with a city in the southwest, or would it just be replaced with a city in England? You know, these are different levels of anonymization. They're different approaches to the data. Sometimes it may be very important to keep the information that I'm in Bristol for the analysis and for the way we interpret the data. But other times it might not be. So these are going to be really individualized decisions for each project. They're not going to be, there's no one rule for it. The other thing that's important to think about is the fact that some people may take part in studies and not want their diagnostic status shared or disclosed in the data set, because they're worried about it being potentially made public later on, or for whatever personal reason. And so we need to think really carefully about making sure that that doesn't happen, even inadvertently, through the way we share data and qualitative data. I think one of the important ways we can try and handle some of these questions is to think about what different sharing options there could be for the data. There's often a principle in open science that you should share everything as much as you can, kind of as easily as you can. But there are options you can that you can offer your participants, and also that you can build into your pre-registration. So it may be that some aspects of the data are only available on request rather than being totally open. But in terms of your participants, it's important to think about things like saying, well, they may want to share everything very happily, or they may want to only share parts of their data, or they may want to opt out of sharing altogether. And you need to think about how to communicate those options, exactly what those options are for your project, and also how to make sure that the different levels of consent your participants give are respected in that final data sharing. So things like making sure all of the team is aware, nobody accidentally uploads just the whole lot without looking at it, those kind of things. I think one of the nice things about pre-registration in autism research is that actually it gives us an opportunity to go Further, pre-registration and open science has been kind of predicated on the assumption that this is going to help us do better science. I think pre-registration can also help us do better participatory work, and I think that's really important. That's something I'm really passionate about. I think there's several ways that this is an opportunity to do that. Things like having positionality statements from the team at the start of the project is really important. So saying whether you are a neurodiverse team, saying which members of the team are neurodivergent, if they're comfortable with that, or sharing which diagnoses there are within the team, if people are comfortable with that. That means that from the very beginning, your participants, your reviewers, everybody understands the position you're coming from. And that's really important. You can talk about things like, do you work in a social model of disability, or are you coming from a neurodiversity paradigm? This kind of thing. I think you can also use it as an opportunity to make your participatory practices really clear and then to stick to them. So the whole idea with pre-registration is that you say what you're going to do, and then you can be questioned if you don't meet those promises. So you can say, the team can say how autistic people or the community are involved in their project at every stage in the pre-registration, and then that can be scrutinized both by the community, did you actually do it, and by reviewers when it gets to the point of publication. So rather than having a generic participation statement, you can say, look at our pre-registration, here are the details of all of the things we did to make sure that this was a truly co-produced piece of work. And if you didn't do them, you're also meant to record that and why. And so your reviewers can check and can criticize or comment on the level of this that you did. I also think it brings the assumptions that the team have into much sharper relief, which is important, because if you, in your pre-registration, kind of have said what theories you're based on, what framework you're working in, these kinds of things, it's easier to see biases in interpreting the results. Something which has been a really big issue historically in autism research. I'm sure lots of us are aware of the fact that plenty of studies originally looked at comparing autistic and non-autistic people on a task, for example, and then regardless of how well autistic people actually did, would find a way of making it look like they were the ones who'd got it wrong, or so there was something different about how they'd responded, even if they'd done better. So being able to see that kind of bias in interpretation through the pre-registration is really useful, and again, something that reviewers and the community can kind of see and potentially criticize or engage with. So what are the big questions left? I think the ethics around data sharing and communicating data sharing options is a really big question. I think there's a question about how do we evaluate qualitative pre-registrations and how do we do that in a rigorous manner, which is why we're interested in developing a set of guidelines for autism qual pre-registrations if we can. And if you're interested in being part of that conversation, feel free to email me. My email's on the Padlet and it's also widely available online. And also, again, as part of that, how do we make sure that community opinions are part of this move towards open science in autism work? I'm particularly interested in how autistic people, what people think of pre-reg for qual work, and how I can make sure that, or we can make sure that their views are included on any guidelines we produce. But in general, we need to know how the community feels about this. What are their concerns? What are their worries? What do they think are the opportunities, to make sure that, you know, as I've just said, the process of doing open science is participatory and co-produced, not just something we suddenly announce we're doing as researchers. Thanks very much.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, Dan and Felicity, for those presentations. They were, of course, very, very interesting. So we've had a few questions come in over the course. which I'm going to fire at you. We've got a few minutes available for answers. So Dan, clearly explained and a compelling argument for pre-registered studies. It strikes me people might also make spurious claims unintentionally, e.g. they unknowingly make analysis mistakes. Does pre-registration also help prevent this?
Yes, so it's a really nice question. So I think it's important there to highlight that pre-registration is in one part of a package of tools that encompass open research. So another area that we did touch on so much within this presentation is about data sharing, potentially code sharing. So that's one route where those kinds of errors could be more readily identified than through the sort of standard version of pre-registration that I talked about. It doesn't necessarily protect so much against that. Although this also highlights where registered reports are really this high-level gold standard form of pre-registration, because with a registered report, you're more likely to typically be asked to make your data and code available. A reviewer will look at it as part of that whole process of looking through your pre-registration and what you're saying you'll do. So in a nutshell, in some instances, it can protect against those kinds of mistakes as well, but it's also part of thinking about open research methods more broadly to address many of the different types of errors that can crop up, as well as questionable research practices.
Wonderful stuff. I think this next one, you both have a perspective on it. So Felicity, if you could answer first. Do you think autism research is on par with other disciplines in reproducible and open research practices, or are we falling behind? And if so, why do you think that is?
Good question. So psychology in general is not, psychology in general is still catching up on the idea of pre-registration compared to things like a lot of the hard sciences. I don't know if autism research is doing significantly worse than other kind of sub-disciplines of psychology, but it's certainly nowhere near standard or even kind of widely talked about yet. So there's a lot of work to do, but I don't know that that's kind of a failing of autism research in particular. Dan?
Yeah, I'd broadly agree. It's kind of hard to assess, really, and it's very subdiscipline by subdiscipline. If you think about the psychological sciences, just that's what I know about. So I would certainly would say that autism research isn't leading the way by any means. I intuitively feel like when I read papers in different psychology journals, it's a bit more common that I'll be coming across studies that are pre-registered or have shared data and so on than in autism research. But yeah, it's hard. I think it'd be really interesting to have some sort of comparison. So like the part of my presentation where I look at the numbers of pre-registrations in autism research, don't actually know how that compares with comparable fields, and that'd be really useful to know if we had some more time. But also in terms of perhaps part of why autism research might not lead, some of the points Felicity made about by the area of data sharing can be quite a sensitive and difficult element in autism research, and so that might be one reason why some of these practices aren't being adopted quite as readily.
And have you got any sort of practical suggestions or things researchers or community members could do to encourage open research practices?
I think just from kind of my own working at Bristol, I know it's being talked about a lot more in terms of kind of open research practices and things like pre-registrations. I think I've been to 2 or 3 workshops in the last year on the topic where I hadn't been to one previously at all. So make it, if you're in a position where you're kind of in a research environment, having that conversation with the team you work with or the department you work in, I think is important, because it is, from what I see, it tends to be one or two people who are really passionate about this who push the conversation forwards. And then you get to a point where it just becomes standard practice for that setting. And I think the more settings where it becomes standard practice, the more we'll see it happening generally. It kind of becomes a snowball effect.
Yeah, the only thing I'd quickly add on there is, so similarly, if you're a researcher, there's things like reproducibility, which is like a journal club. That certainly was my entry point, or really accelerated my sort of knowledge around open research methods. And also, perhaps if you're not in research, or if you are as well, as following online, a lot of the discussion does happen on Twitter, and you can find, you just learn by following people and picking up this sort of information online.
Great stuff. One specifically for Dan here. If you are peer reviewing a paper that has been pre-registered, to what extent should you scrutinize the pre-registration to ensure consistency with the manuscript? And just a wee comment on that they put, it said, it seems like good practice, but could take a lot of time with consideration for the kind of time constraints on peer reviewers that we have.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because peer review is something that takes a lot of time as it is. It's unpaid, takes away from your actual job, what you're being paid to do. So it's challenging. I haven't actually ever been asked so far in my career to peer review a pre-registered study. I would like to think if that happens, I'd want to be following it quite closely, just trying to check some of the sort of, at the very least, the key elements. Pre-registration documents don't always have to be super long. It's just making sure that the hypotheses map on, and the dependent variables and how they're calculated and what analysis they've said they'd use. So optimally, I'd want to make time for that, but also appreciating that it is quite time consuming as it is, and then adding in a bit longer for cross-referencing the pre-registration will just extend that a bit. But it's a really valuable element of the peer review process. So if you have the pre-reg document available to you, it would certainly be a useful thing to do.
Indeed. Talking of publications, what something you can both maybe address is, do you think the move to open research practice is going to influence journals to make research papers open access, i.e. free?
Well, research papers are never free totally, is what I would say. Someone's always paying. I think a lot of journals are moving towards having more and more open access options and different levels of it. And there are some journals which are making everything open access for people to read. That then means that the researchers are paying to publish. So you then can run into issues with, like, does your funder support that, or can you not get the funds? Yeah, it gets into the nitty-gritty of the funding rather than the principles, I think, often. But I don't know if you have anything else to say, Dan.
I'm not sure I have much more to add on that, but yeah, I suppose I often feel like because it's about openness, having freely available publications gets sort of bracketed in with sort of other open research methods, where it does sort of stand alone in its own area somewhat, because it is the responsibility of the, you need the journals to be able to offer that, whereas the researchers can really drive forward with the other open research methods. So yeah, I'm not too sure if I can add much more to what Felicity said.
Wonderful. Well, I'm aware that we are running into lunch, and the session sort of overran slightly. I think I know that you both are wanting to sort of continue to promote open research practices within the autism field, and you've got some things to do with that you might want to mention.
Yeah, so we've got a Padlet that's currently on the Slido chat. Just if anyone wants to share their thoughts on things we've talked about today, or your ideas about how we can try and kind of improve the process of pre-registration in autism research. I, along with a couple of other autism researchers at the moment, are trying to come up with kind of guidelines for doing qualitative pre-registration and registered reports in autism research. So if you are interested in talking to me about that or hearing about what we're doing with that, please email me and I will add you to the list of people who are part of that conversation.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, thanks once again, guys. It's been a really, really great symposium, and the conference and festival will be back at 1 p.m. on this page for a session on underserved groups within autism research. So we'll see you there. Adios.
Thank you.